development strategies. I sit within a particular piece of that agency referred to as the Center for Economic Transformation. And in that big name, Center for Economic Transformation, we actually kind of serve as a think and do tank. In that regard, our role is really thinking of some of the new sectors growing within the city's economy and what can we do about it. Oftentimes we do our own version of prototyping. Essentially, we try to create and address policy as well as implement programmatic initiatives to address current and relevant issues faced by various sectors of the economy to create good jobs and promote entrepreneurship and economic diversification. We're really particularly excited to be part of today's conversation as a way to kick it off, largely because we've been trying to, frankly, we've been at the space of recognizing the emergence of the maker community here in New York City, and we were able to pull together some great thought leaders here in New York who can share their stories. Essentially, this really embodies what we try to do at the city, which is really convene thought leaders, learn from them, and develop new programs and initiatives to address challenges or issues that they've come across, and what is the city's role to address that. Essentially, it was through that space where several years ago we developed a rapid prototyping fabrication map that helped us identify that there's a lot of different places in New York City that people who are making something needs to find affordable space. And it was through that fabrication map that we then learned further that it's not just about where these locations are, it's about creating an ecosystem for people who want to make and produce their products here in New York to access that equipment and to find the talent to develop a business, as well as implementing new forms of advanced technologies. It was through that understanding of that ecosystem and the needs of that ecosystem that we started the New York's Next Top Makers program. And it's really the sort of building blocks of talent, innovation, and next generation manufacturing that really has helped us modify the program. This year will be our second year of running it, and actually we're very excited because this year we really learned from our previous iteration. We learned that we need to do more to help build and connect the ecosystem together, and so we are launching a 5-borough pop-up tour starting tonight. We'll be also building out a citywide maker map, which will be live and evolving, which will list both makers, manufacturers, fabrication facilities, and maker-related events happening across all 5 boroughs. Also, we'll be selecting 6 makers, 6 teams who will join us for a 12-month studio. And they'll be in this incubation program, and tonight we're going to hear from, or this morning rather, we'll be hearing from one of last year's winners. And basically, in this studio, the hope is that we'll get them from the idea of concept and prototype to fabrication to running a real business. And we'll be announcing those 6 finalists on Sunday in the afternoon. So we hope you, if you're around, would join us. But again, it's about us as a city, recognize the critical ingredients that make this community tick. It's us not necessarily supplanting or necessarily coming up with it ourselves. It's recognizing those ingredients and help fostering those ingredients, which is why, again, the majority of this morning's conversation is going to be from the experts. So to hear more, I'm going to turn it over to Surya. Surya? Right, sorry about that. Haven't had enough coffee. So I'd like to introduce Surya, who's a designer, engineer, and winner of last year's Next Top Makers program. His current project, PowerClip, won the competition last year. His work is he's currently working at Bell Labs and also as a research fellow at ITP at NYU. His work has also been featured in the New York Times, Wired, and the Daily News. He's also, some of his work has been exhibited at Building 92 in the Navy Yard, as well as the Museum of Art and Design in New York. So can you tell me a bit more about the entrepreneurial community and the maker talent pipeline in New York City based on your experience?
Yeah, definitely. So I got into this world by going to ITP at NYU, which is the Interactive Telecommunications Program. And through ITP, I was exposed to this really, really huge ecosystem of makers in the city. It kind of goes back to a bit of like to PowerClip. So PowerClip was a project that came out of Hurricane Sandy. When Sandy hit, me and my collaborators at ITP, we noticed this need for people to be able to charge their devices when infrastructure goes down. And we realized that people were getting together and congregating to like solve this problem by really simple things like putting out power strips outside their house to make it easier for people to charge their devices. And they came from boroughs and neighborhoods that didn't have electricity. And we thought it was a simple problem to solve, and we started trying to do it. And even though like technically it wasn't a very hard thing to solve, the thing that made it possible and got it to the stage we're at now is the people we met and the people we spoke to. We had a simple design to start with, spoke to some Fab Lab people in Brooklyn. They gave us some recommendations. We managed to iterate on the process, talk to other people, talk to like electronic engineers and more like specific people who had better understanding of manufacturing processes. And it was a very like natural process. We didn't have to force our way into anything. What was really nice was that no one asked us, why are you making this? They're like, oh yeah, we get it. We saw how that happened. And,
Right.
and because no one ever asked us that, and we never had to think about how am I going to pitch this to a VC, how am I going to pitch this to someone, we were just making it to a point where we had something and then we could pitch it to people.
Right.
And that sort of like natural workflow, I don't think was possible before, just because you couldn't prototype and design the way you can right now.
Mm-hmm. So what was it particularly in terms of, do you see for New York? I mean, it sounds like you leveraged and got connected to a community of talented people. What do you think makes New York a space where those folks are attracted to or want to be in, given?
I mean, honestly, I think it's people care. like fundamentally, it's like people care and people like to use their hands and get dirty over here. Mm-hmm. So if you want to find a place where you can go and make something, it's not that hard. And when you go to that place, everyone the really nice thing about this maker community is that they love dumb questions. You know, when you go in and you say, I've never done this before, you don't feel embarrassed, and it's easy to like learn from that and like harness experts and like people who've been doing this for years, because one, the tools make it easy for you to play and break things and try again without too much cost. And two, the people who tend to be in that space make it easy for you. They encourage you to explore your ideas and try things out that don't necessarily make sense till you've tried them.
Right. So that's a nice segue to think through in terms of you know, the maker community and the talent side. I want to hear a bit more about the innovation side, because I think very much connected to talent is the space for innovation. So Rob, I would, Sanchez from Manufacture New York, you're the Chief Strategy Officer there. You've started a number of companies, particularly startups in fashion. And your last company, you did Fashioning Our Industry, which was a fashion-focused pitch event series, which resulted in a number of new companies successfully finding funding. Can you tell us more about the new technologies and production methods that you've been using at Manufacture New York? And more broadly, what you think the role technology is playing for production in New York City?
Sure. What's really interesting about fashion is that every piece of clothing you're wearing is still touched by a human hand at almost every point through the process. And so where we're finding chances to innovate is actually coming from combining the newest technology with the oldest skills in the handwork. And it's about knowing how to connect the dots all the way along the way. That really is allowing us to solve new problems and find new ways to innovate inside of the industry. So we're working on projects where it's a swimsuit with the inner components of the swimsuit being 3D printed to create a mold that allows us to make a silicone cast that then we can wrap in a high-tech fiber from a new fiber that Invista has put out, and so on. And it's sort of blending all along the way traditional knowledge, new technologies, and what's new that's out there. And where we're finding it to be the most interesting is when we combine that with something that's technical that took hundreds of years to develop, and that craft then adds that finishing touch that makes it special. And we're in an interesting point here in New York City where we're about 5 years from losing a lot of the incredible artisans who've made this such a great fashion city. And so another place that the innovation is coming in is coming back to teaching people about those old skills and giving them a way of thinking about what they know now from that context of that historical development.
So in terms of, can you give us a few examples of some specific technologies that sort of, you know, that you find interesting or ones that kind of took you by surprise with? I mean, oftentimes when I think of fashion, I just think probably a little more traditionally, but I've been really impressed by companies who are using other CNC machinery to cut cloth, for example. So what's been the wow factor for you?
For me, I'm fascinated by fibers and new fibers that are out there. I just was speaking with somebody who's taking fibers and building in batteries inside of the fibers so that you can change the way that you access power when you're thinking about wearable technology. So it's the ability to say, this is the problem I'm solving, I need more surface area, how do I do that? And then combine that with the actual textile itself. The amazing thing about fashion is that you're not building static objects, you're building objects that interact over time in 3 dimensions with multiple movements and articulations of the body. And at the same time, we have these expectations of what they look like. And so what I'm really fascinated about is the actual textile side and looking at what are new ways that we can use knitting machines to adapt and change the way that we construct the garments so that they fit and map to the body a lot better. And so you're seeing sort of these new thought processes around how do we access these machines that have been around in China for 10 years and bring them here to the US and then combine it with what we developed out of the DuPont labs. And it's really about bringing all of that together inside of a single space and then having the access to the people to ask questions that allows you to push that forward.
And do you think, why New York? Could you do this in any other city? Is there something particular about New York that makes it?
Yeah, so the interesting thing in the fashion industry is just the history in New York. And what we're finding with Manufacture New York is that there's a lot of interest in us replicating the project across the US. But every single person who's coming to us has something different that they're focused on specifically. New York is really about the end product and the creativity and the expression, and it's about bringing all the pieces together for that final piece that the consumer enjoys. But we're seeing other cities where their interest is much earlier in the supply chain. They're looking at innovations in farm equipment and new ways to bring and spin fibers and so on. So what we've found is that New York is great because you're constrained by space, so you tend to work together a lot more. And that gives you access in a way that you never would have if you were in a place where it was cheap to buy a lot of land and a lot of space. So at the final stage of the product, having so many different people, inside of our incubator, we have people working on everything from handbags all the way through to couture gowns. And it's really fascinating when that person is struggling with a certain hinge fastening on a handbag, and the person who does the couture gowns can solve that because of a technique that she uses in pleating. And it's that cross-fertilization that happens from the space constraints of a tight, compact city, I think, that makes what we're doing possible.
That's something I hear often about New York, and why I think, again, to the earlier comments about talent, is that in a way, the constraints of a city, as frustrating as I imagine many of you experience it, can actually lead to new ideas and innovation and access to people that you wouldn't necessarily be if you were in a much more spread out location. So I'd like to kind of think through on the sort of the next larger piece that goes in the big puzzle and the recipe, if you will, next generation manufacturing. So I want to hear from you, Tom. Tom Kenny, you run Refactory in Brooklyn, which creates circuit boards and does a variety of electronics manufacturing. And many times when I talk to folks that this is happening in New York, they think I have 3 heads. So, you've worked on a number of various technical projects that have made medical devices, industrial control systems, robotics. The list goes long. You've worked at Honeybee Robotics, again, which is here in New York City, is an aerospace company. Who knew New York City? And then from Honeybee, you co-founded Energy Hub, and now you're the director of development, CTO, and you run Refactory. So can you tell me more about the next generation of manufacturing, what you think manufacturing will look like for New York City?
Sure. I think right now we're at this amazing convergence of a lot of things. And the iWatch debut was a big part of that, and kind of for the first time saying this is the most personal thing that Apple's ever made. A lot of our products right now are made in large football field-sized factories, that are halfway across the globe. And these factories are making millions of units that come in, let's say, at the most personalized level, 2 colors. So So that's one thing that's going to change, and I think that this personalization is going to turn into this highly segmented market of devices that cater to smaller subsets of the market. And that innovation is going to come from makers, inventors, artists, who are going to be a big part of kind of also changing another part of this convergence that I call the hard, ugly edge of technology that we've been dealing with for about 30 years, where our main way of interacting with the internet or with the cloud or whatever is through a touchscreen keyboard. I call it like when I see someone on Instagram, they're like, it's like a human blue screen. They kind of just like freeze and stop and kind of step out of the experience. And I think that as it's kind of been a little too long that we've been interacting with the internet this way, and that is going to become more integrative through people like artists, fashion designers, different innovators that are going to be making units that aren't maybe made at 1 million units a month, but maybe will have a total run of 10,000 units. And so at Refactory, the other thing we're realizing is a lot of these amazing new things that inventors and really creative people are making are based on platforms like the Arduino or Raspberry Pi or BeagleBone. And typically when you go to a CM, wherever they are, it's like when you show them the design, it's like taking off the blindfold. They like reverse engineer the whole thing, cost it out, and then kind of put it back together instead of using it in a way that like, okay, this is an Arduino-based design, let's just go with that and have. So what we do is we modularize the design to be able to get smaller makers up and running quickly, cheaper, because we're not reverse engineering it and putting it back together. So a lot of what we're doing is trying to make it more accessible for smaller makers to make something for 5,000 units or 10,000 units by leveraging these platforms.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think is specifically in New York City that is poised to be a good hub for allowing these sort of recognition of these changes in desires and demands in the marketplace? And again, given the constraints of a city like us, I mean, this is not an easy place to.
Sure, yeah, I mean, you know, a big problem, a lot of people always point to the supply chain issues, which I think, so in my experience in going to the Pearl River Delta area, you're usually going to one of those malls because you messed something up. You know, like you're like, oh, I need to buy a tantalum cap. And you go to this mall and you like, or whatever, like we bought a thermal printer for one project I was working, we went to the thermal printer like district. And the reason you have to do that is because you didn't think that you needed a thermal printer. So I think a lot of the, but you can still buy parts and get it the next day. So I think a lot of the supply chain issues, and the big challenge with that comes from better planning in the design and development of the process that makes the product. But I think really what New York has to offer is a lot of these products are becoming, more importantly, a brand and experience, and those brands and experiences are created here. And then they get made halfway across the globe. So if the people creating the brands and the experience at marketing companies and product design firms, which are like here, can work closely and make stuff that's better catered to their market really quickly, they can really iterate and make really great products. So I think there are certainly some disadvantages, but I think the creative capital that's here makes up for that, and you can probably capture that in larger margins, which is something that Apple does by integrating better design into their product.
So what do you think, and I appreciate what you said, in that there's these ingredients, again, these components of the designers and the people who've got big ideas, but because it's made elsewhere, there's a bit of a lost opportunity, and then there's folks who are doing this on a much smaller scale. Like, what is that bridge? What will make a place where New York City can rise as this big maker city in terms of doing better connections between these pieces? And all of you, feel free to answer on this one.
Well, I think it's stuff, well, personally, it's stuff that we're doing. But it's also, yeah.
It's a safe place.
Thanks, yeah. It's also, I think it's also getting more people involved. Like, there's also, like, a lot of this is born out of these amazing communities like NYC Resistor, Alpha One Labs, like, just places where you can go and be totally clueless and learn how to make stuff, and people are there to help you. And then there's like the next phase, which I think is what we're trying to build up. I think that it's getting there, and there's such a heritage in New York for manufacturing. It's here, like it was here. It's like a hub for some. But yeah, I don't.
Just to pick up on what you're saying, the first stage of people picking up this stuff, I think that's really important here, because like I have an electronic engineering degree, and that means that I've learned things in a formal way with like a certain understanding of what a microcontroller is or what this is or that is. But people who haven't done that and like jump into this stuff like Arduino or something like that, they just think about it differently. So they ask questions which you just make assumptions about, and it likely opens up the space to think about things in a different way because they don't have any of the biases you have, having like the expertise, as they say.
Right. It allows for a little more disruption, if you will, because they're kind of forcing you to look at it from a completely different perspective that, in a way, makes you rethink maybe that doesn't need to be so formal. And I think for me, this is where a lot of the stuff that maybe Manufacturing New York is really doing, and it's sort of merging old and new. And I don't know if you can talk a bit about more of those challenges and the opportunities you guys are trying to create from that space.
Sure. So one of the challenges that we have right now is that the schools in fashion have not been teaching technical skills, like very, very detailed technical skills, for a while. And what happened was, as the manufacturing moved out of New York and moved overseas, this focus shifted to brand creation, design, and so on, but not technical design, because it was always assumed that your factory would fix that on the fly. So the end result is now we're looking at all these entrepreneurs coming out of fashion schools who want to create amazing clothes and actually lack the technical capabilities to do so, even though they have brilliant designs. So what we're doing is filling in that technical gap so that they can actually go out and produce it. And it's amazing how a single change in a seam can make something either cost $1,000 in the store or $500 in the store. And being able to catch that early on in the production so you can actually plan ahead into the target market is phenomenal. And so what we're really finding is that taking these old sets of knowledge is absolutely vital for us to start to move forward, because you kind of innovate on a stepwise fashion if you don't have the history. Otherwise, you still are on that growth curve. So if you're jumping in and saying, okay, I can cut a garment this way and it'll be great, and a 3D body scan will do it, and it'll output my pattern and so on, you kind of get stuck at that level. But if you're able to know that what the next steps to do after you have that 3D body scan and that pattern, and then you can tweak and change and iterate because you have this deep depth of background, then you're able to do so much more. So what we see, there's a lot of talk about disruption in the industry. What we kind of want to do is shift the focus from disruption, which we see as breaking the innovation cycle, to more expansion, which is how do we take this new tool and treat it as a tool and not an industry killer, and then integrate that into these traditional knowledge bases as a step forward as an entire industry.
Yeah, I think that's a huge, that's a big part of this too, is that there's two things. There's like that loss of technical capability, but the other part of that, which has been really interesting, when you go overseas and see these factories, you learn that like 80% of the sneakers are made in one place, like of all sneakers. And so you start to ask, like, what is the brand? Is it just ketchup that goes on at the end to make it something good, or is like should the company really be involved at every seam? And I think we're kind of getting to the point where we're starting to notice that every laptop is made by the same people. Like so I think as people, as like locally, we learn to get more technical, we can really make improvements at every level of the design and really make like compelling products.
And so where do you think, I think you're spot on in terms of that, like what is it that's necessary to see more of that in New York City?
It's educational initiatives, but one of the most amazing things about going overseas too is they, at the factory that we worked with, every Chinese New Year, the workers would come back and they'd say, what do you want to learn this year? And so it became like a huge economic, it's a huge social and economic ladder for a lot of people that it's one of the greatest stories of economic development in history is what's happened in the Pearl River Delta. And it's as a result of these factories up-training people from, being farm workers to being managers of a line. And I think educational initiatives in New York to help people learn these skills and come learn from putting screws into a product to managing the line to becoming QA manager to all that other stuff is would be huge for improving the situation.
Well, I mean, that's something, I think when we think about how we can incorporate more of that appreciation and integration into our educational system, I think it's really critical for that next generation, especially as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of talent that will be retiring soon. And so frankly, I see this oftentimes in sort of the old guard manufacturing companies we work with on the city level, is that a lot of, there's this fear, I can't find the right talent. So, what else could the city be doing, or do you see happening that you'd like to see scaled up, whether it's here in New York or elsewhere, that can really help deepen that appreciation and desire to, tighten the screw or work on QA or work in this space?
For me, I think it's the growth of apprenticeship and workforce development and sort of an appreciation of that at every level of our society, but really also the recognition that that's not an alternate career path to an education, that it is in itself an education, and sort of celebrate that more and make it more accessible. So I'm somebody who thinks with my hands, who struggled all the way through school and couldn't handle it. I did law school by not attending classes, but building companies. And so being able to support people like that and give them places, so Hypothekids and programs like that is, I think, through Harlem Biospace. Being able to build these programs that give kids the ability to work with their hands in an education setting where they can build these skills themselves, and then celebrating that at the city level, I think is going to be key to moving us forward in the future.
What about you? Do you think there's something that get more folks like yourself to come up with new devices to?
I think it's what you're saying. It's the hands-on mentality. It's the thinking with your hands and making the thing for yourself and just playing with it to get a sense of what's going on. Because I think one of the big problems we have right now is that it leads to a bigger conversation. But we're consumers of these devices, and we're consumers of them at this expert level of an iPhone, these really slick products. But when you get down to playing with them and actually tinkering with these boards and seeing these LEDs turn on and off, it kind of reveals the magic behind the box, and you realize that how these, it's informative, and it actually helps be a better part of society. When if a company does something that some tech journalists or tech bloggers are not happy about, it makes it easier to engage. Oh, I know why that's bad. They shouldn't be doing it like that. It kind of holds everyone to a higher standard. So I think just being more hands-on and getting people to play with this stuff more is important, because more and more of our lives are part of this.
Right. Well, I agree, and I'm going to put my additional plug in that I mentioned earlier, that we're working on this Maker map largely to help communicate and translate where are these places that facilitate these hands-on experiences, or places where you can do a short run, or places that are sort of in that community space that you can ask your questions that may not be the smartest questions, but a safe place nonetheless. So I encourage anyone in this room, look us up, we'll disseminate this, but it would be great because it's very interactive. It's really much like you putting your pin on the map and disseminating your information, updating it as you need, because I think for where we're at the city level, this is something we're very interested in. It's obviously through some of the work we've been doing, but I think you're right. It's mission critical. It has to be the community. It can't necessarily be top down, though we can help foster and set the foundation for some ingredient making, but nonetheless, it really has to be driven from the community. And I think for me, at least as an observer and a fan of the space, I think what's particularly exciting is how this space empowers certain neighborhoods and communities as they learn, as they question. It translates beyond the thing, but to location and place. And it can be really exciting in a way of empowerment in a way that a lot of things are not. And I don't know if there's any last thoughts you guys would like to add to the conversation.
I mean, I think a big part of what's happening is just here, this whole community, this conference, the Maker Fair, it's just grown exponentially. And I think we're well on our way to kind of achieving a lot of these changes that we're looking for. So.
Yeah. Great. I think we're good. Thanks.